Hello and welcome to another episode of Defence Uncut, the first dedicated English language Pakistani defense commentary podcast, where we unpack Pakistani military procurements, events, and broader strategic issues in focused detail so you can build a clearer and more accurate big picture. This episode covers about 2 weeks of major developments across Pakistan's armed forces. From the commissioning of the country's first Hangor-class AIP submarine to the Army's accelerating shift towards precision fire and precision strike capabilities, as well as the completion of Pakistan's electro-optical satellite Constellation and a retrospective on the Pakistan Navy's surface fleet. I have with me Arslan Khan. How are you, Arslan?
Yeah, I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. So let's just get right into it. We'll start with the headliner, which was the induction of PNSM Hangor, the first Hangor-class submarine, basically a derivative of the Yuan-class Type 039B platform, and it's equipped with a Stirling-cycle air-independent propulsion system. So, I'd love to get your thoughts on the induction, the platform, and, the capabilities it promises to bring to the Pakistan Navy.
Yeah, I mean, the program we saw, it was a very under the covers type program. We didn't really get a lot of news, and actually, I think one of the biggest questions people had was, is this even going to happen anymore? Because obviously, we saw the collapse of the Type 214 deal. We saw effectively the collapse of the Augusta, because the original plan, I believe, was to develop that further with the purchase of the transfer of technology and all that. So it was a program that was kept under very tight wraps. In fact, we also didn't even see the lease. The one, I believe, in the CNS's outgoing speech, there was he mentioned that we would receive one on a lease for training purpose, and we didn't even see that happen. But what we did see was the build-up of facilities, Karachi shipyard, and the slow building of the program, it built up very slowly to the point now where we've seen the induction of the first boat. But yeah, so as I mentioned, we initially had the collapse of the Type 214 deal, and I think you might be better placed to touch on why that was.
Yeah, for sure. Back in the, I would say, mid to late 2000s, so between 2005 to 2009, the Pakistan Navy was negotiating for 3 or 4 Type 214s from Germany's ThyssenKrupp Marine Systems, TKMS, and they had almost closed on an actual deal. It was around, I think, 1.2, 1.3 billion euros at the time, so this was around 2009, 2010. What happened, though, was basically, it was a mix of deep fiscal issues within Pakistan. So Pakistan had undergone a very deep fiscal crunch since, when the new government at the time came in, that was led by Zardari, basically. Zardari and Yusuf Gilani. But I would say, I wouldn't put the bulk of the blame on them, even though, I think a lot of folks would. I mean, they were certainly their government was definitely controversial in terms of fiscal corruption, what have you. But there are some other factors as well, like the monetary crash, the fiscal of the great, recession. So all those factors, plus Germany's lack of willingness, I think, to extend a loan to Pakistan for the submarines, all sort of compounded and caused that program to sort of collapse. And then around the early 2010s, around 2012, 2013 period, the Pakistan Navy began basically speaking to China for 6 submarines, which was then revised towards 8 boats by 2015. When the deal was signed in around 2015, there was for basically 8 S-26, so this is basically the export version of the Yuan with the AIP system. And at that point, there were a lot of questions. At least in Kuwa, we used to write about it quite a bit. We were asking, what kind of AIP system would it use? Because, the original idea was with the Chinese was that they would offer the platform, but it would be up to the customer to select the engines, the AIP, and what have you. And I sort of both kind of guessed and figured and hoped that the Pakistan Navy would try to use, German propulsion and maybe even the German fuel cell based, AIP system that they could have gotten for the Type 214. Because the advantage with the fuel cell architecture than the Arabian Sea is that the Arabian Sea, from what I recall, it's a bit of a warmer climate, basically. So vibrations in the sea itself will move much quicker. So the problem with the Stirling-cycle AIP system is that it has a lot of dynamic moving components. Maybe not a lot, but just enough that it could create a potential risk of acoustic exposure. Whereas with fuel cells, although they result in a slower submarine, you have no moving parts, basically, or very few. So meaning that you can control your acoustic signature really well. I think a lot of that was sort of compensated out by several factors. Number one, that the Hangor's design uses a double hull design. So I think that's how the Chinese were able to sort of focus on the acoustic control mechanism. And the other side of it being that, unlike the Type 214, which is really being procured for the more classical anti-area access denial sort of strategy, where you would have these boats parked in the busiest waters in the areas, where you have, let's say, basically you have them parked to basically prevent Indian naval activity closer to the Pakistani shores. And for that, the Pakistan Navy has actually pursued a different program. Whereas I think with the Hangor-class, I think they sort of revised their strategy to be more proactive, to be more forward-facing. So basically, these submarines being larger, longer ranged, more endurance, faster, would basically operate more basically farther out in the exclusive economic zone, or farther out in where Pakistan, the PN considers its basically area of responsibility. So you could see these submarines potentially operate, towards the Gulf area, closer towards the Indian Ocean, and basically sort of spread the coverage net of the Pakistan Navy. So that's basically the background story on, how the German submarine deal collapsed. That being said, there were some rumors here and there, maybe as late as 2017, 2018, that the Pakistan Navy was interested in potentially procuring the Type 214. There was even like this random Jane's article one time where the journalist basically said that TKMS was like talking to the PN for like 2 submarines or something. But I think all those doors shut when the German government, for whatever reason, decided it was going to value the Indian market more for the time being. And I think a lot of the things that the Pakistan Navy was requesting from the German government, including the engines that would have gone into the Hangor, kind of basically got canceled or blocked. So in regards to that, the Pakistan Navy sort of revised the strategy, and now they have like a dual submarine strategy, basically. So you had the Hangors, which would basically cover the sea lines of communication. They would operate at long range, long endurance further out. And then you have the shallow water attack submarine, which would probably basically be the successor to the Type 214 program. So they would operate much closer to shore and be that defensive layer submarine, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've basically covered all the points pretty well. I think one quick thing I want to touch on before people leave comments on this is when you said the German government decided to value the Indian market more. I think what I would also say on that is when we say stuff like this, the Pakistani market is basically so little competition that a lot of these vendors, they can effectively guarantee themselves contracts, whereas the Indian market is so crowded, it's so full of red tape and bureaucracy and just nonsense in general, which you don't get in the Pakistani market. It's far easier to do business, I would argue, in Pakistan. So that's what we say when we don't understand why the vendors would alienate the Pakistani market. I think that's what you were getting at with that. In terms of some more context in the program, so 4 of the submarines were meant to be built in China. And they are all 4 of them, I believe, are in the sort of final-ish stages of handover. Between fitting out and like sea trials and stuff, I think maybe we could expect the next boat within, next year or within the year, for example. The Pakistani boats are a lot more delayed. And unfortunately, this comes back to the issue always with Pakistani procurement is there's just no money. With the first Hangor boat, I believe was properly laid down in Pakistan, I think maybe 4 or 3 years ago. And the progress on it was quite slow. This is something I'd personally seen. This was May 2023-ish. You had maybe the first section of the hull being worked on. So the progress was quite slow, and it just came down to a lack of funds. This would basically more than triple the Pakistan Navy's submarine fleet between the 3 the AIP-equipped submarine fleet between the 3 Augustas and now eventually the 8 Hangors. You'd have a fleet of 11 AIP-equipped subs. This doesn't include the Augusta 70s, obviously, because they're not AIP-equipped, and they're sort of struggling with their serviceability. So we've got a fleet of 11 submarines, and I believe initially, and you can correct me on this, Bilal, is the Pakistan Navy had a requirement of I think 18 submarines, which is why there was the whole transfer of technology of the Augusta program, because the goal was, and I remember this being said during the commissioning ceremony of PNS Khalid, was I think 18 submarines was the initial goal. I don't know if that's.
I'm not sure if they reached 18 back then,
They
but
didn't reach that goal.
yeah. No, I mean like the goal even. Like I'm not sure if they reached the goal of 18. I'm not sure if they set the goal at 18 back then, because I think the general idea was that in general, due to the asymmetry between the physical capacity between India and Pakistan would generally favor a disproportionately sized submarine fleet, right, relative to India. So in this case, like relative to the size of its coastline, its surface fleet, and what have you, the Pakistan Navy will always have like a disproportionate submarine fleet. Now, as a result of the outgrowth of India's submarine capabilities and surface ship capabilities, the requirement for more submarines basically swelled since the time of the Augusta program. So I think, a fair assertion might be that at the time when the Augusta 9DB program was being conceived, the Pakistan Navy might have been looking at, like, let's say 9 to 12 subs of that size and what have you. But now, moving forward into the 20s, or rather 2030s and more and later, they're going to be looking at basically 18. And depending on if you were to include smaller subsurface platforms like unmanned underwater vehicles, potentially XL-sized unmanned underwater vehicles, and all those sorts of asymmetrical and new technologies, basically, you could have like 18 plus subsurface platforms, basically, of different sizes and capabilities. And again, the general idea is that because essentially, like, when you think about it from a stealthiness standpoint, so the ability to evade enemy, anti-ship or anti-submarine capabilities, or let's say enemy, interdiction capabilities, from the ability to, avoid enemy detection, the ability to move, with as minimal exposure across different spectrals, such as like radar and what have you. Basically, underwater, your main issue is basically thermal and acoustic, especially acoustic, and also from the standpoint of being able to wield the kind of heavyweight munitions to do both anti-ship and anti-submarine operations. A submarine ends up being like your best bang of the buck. Like, if you're a navy with limited fiscal means, your first order of priority should always be to really build that submarine fleet, because that'll be your first, like, it's not just an issue of having submarines at sea, but it's also making sure that you have a sufficient number cycling through between maintenance and active duty. Like, I think with Iran, I think all of their mainline fully sized submarines were basically at shore going through maintenance, right? So that they lost their submarine fleet very quickly. In the case of Pakistan, you would want to make sure not only are your shore-based submarines properly secured, that goes into like having, deeply embedded pens and what have you, but also you would want to have enough of a number where, let's say, for every 1/3 in maintenance, the other 2/3 are out in the sea. So that's your first order of priority as a navy, is to build your submarine force. And then from there, you would build your coastal defenses and aviation. And the last component will be your surface fleet. So I think where it gets interesting with the Pakistan Navy, and we'll go into this in the next section, was that around the mid 2010s, they sort of, I feel like they might have maybe put, maybe not a break, but slowed down on the submarine side to focus more on the surface ship side. But I feel like, given, as you said, the fiscal issue, like, for example, there's not enough money to really kick the accelerator on the Hangor-class production in Karachi. Perhaps there would have been money if money was not spent on surface warships, right? Like, so I think moving forward, they might potentially reevaluate that as well. But yeah, like, definitely in general, the idea will always be for the Pakistan Navy to maintain a disproportionately sized subsurface fleet.
Yeah, and so just to make another sort of digression here is also the other thing is the Pakistan Navy has been expanding in basically every single aspect of its force in significant amounts. The Sea Sultan program is probably a multi-billion dollar program. Those airframes themselves are hundreds of millions of dollars. And then on top of that, the Pakistan Navy is going to foot the bill most likely for the modification, the certification, the testing, and the development of all of these onboard modifications, like, for example, a rotary bomb bay. These are multi-billion dollar programs, and the Pakistan Navy is simultaneously running multiple of them while also being the lowest funded lowest funded branch of the armed forces. At some point, cuts are going to need to be made. Sorry, back to my original point. Is effectively the point I'm trying to make here is the Pakistan Navy has always understood the value of the submarine force and how it needs to be padded very well. Unfortunately, with the war on terror and all that sort of stuff, the funds were never available to build on the Augusta fleet. But now the funds were allocated to the Hangor class. So now as I was saying, we'll have we'll basically triple the size of the AIP fleet of submarines. But also, as you mentioned, the Type 214 program will probably be replaced with the shallow water attack sub program. And as we mentioned in a previous episode as well, is that we see Fincantieri and Daman make investments into Pakistan naval programs via PMS, the Maritime Technology Park, and that's a long-term commitment, right? That's they're here to say they've opened up an office in Pakistan, they've committed to development, research and development within Pakistan. So it's a long-term commitment they've made. And Fincantieri obviously makes great submarines, and they've got shipyards all over the place, and they also have the S-800 submarine, which is a derivative of the S-1000, which was a submarine that was actually offered to India in partnership with the Russians after the split between India and after a split and the eventual deselection, the submarine not being selected, the Italians went back, basically un-Russianed the submarine and built their own submarine out of it using technology from the Type 214 and also German fuel cells like the ones found on the Type 214 and the Type 212. I suspect that's probably the angle the Pakistan Navy is going to take in terms of its submarine force in the future, is have a fleet of Hangors for the offensive work, the deep water offensive work, blockades and anti-shipping, and then have the S-800s or whatever they end up modifying that into, because the Pakistan Navy never really buys anything off the shelf. It's always been modified into what it wants. Whatever they turn the S-800s into for coastal defense, for sea lines of communication and whatnot. Other than that, if we look back into the Hangors, we can see that we'd introduce a lot of new systems into the Pakistan Navy's fleet. So, for example, the Pakistan Navy, I believe, initially had always wanted a supersonic missile, supersonic anti-ship cruising missile, and then you also had a ship-launched ballistic missile. And it seems that both of these programs have been merged into SMASH, or what is now called SMASH, which we know is a derivative of the Fatah-II, which is something we'll talk about later. But that's still, the gap is still there. The Pakistan Navy still wants a supersonic cruising missile. Now, obviously, they've got the CN-302 via the Type 054As, but we've not seen any indication that that's something that they've decided to make a mainstay and produce locally and equip the rest of the ships with. We can see that, for example, the Babur-class is now being equipped with the SMASH as well. So we can see potentially there's a gap there that maybe will be filled via the Hangors, because the Hangors are capable of carrying the CA-02 and also the YJ, and there are both export versions for both. The PN already operates the CA-02, but obviously they are looking to equip something far more capable into their arsenal. So that only leaves the YJ-18, which is probably going to be one of the biggest additions of weapon systems into the Pakistan Navy's fleet, and potentially one we'll see far more induction of. And obviously, with such a large submarine fleet, we could probably expect them to localize the production and build them at home as well, like they did with the Zerb, and set up coastal batteries and whatnot with them. And the YJ-18 is a very interesting weapon as well. So obviously, it's derived from a Russian system, the Club, the 3M54 specifically. And what it is basically it's a rocket, kind of like the Fatah-II, but with a cruising aspect. So it basically takes the back end of a Club cruise missile and mates it to a rocket. What happens is it cruises really, really low for most of the flight, and then in the terminal stage, it will ditch the propulsion of the cruise missile and the wings and whatnot, and it will turn into effectively a ballistic missile. So it's a very interesting solution. It's one that is unique to the system, and it's one that I think would be quite interesting to the Pakistan Navy and in its induction. But yeah, so that's in terms of the main sort of new weapon system we'd see. Other than that, the Pakistan Navy has been operating heavy torpedoes for a while, and they operate very, very advanced ones. They use German DM-2A4s, which are from Atlas Electronic, and they're a very, very capable system, and they are used on the Augusta-class, and potentially we could even see them being deployed on further procurements like the shallow water subs. But yeah, so in terms of why the Pakistan Navy needs a large submarine fleet, I'll throw that back at you, Bilal, but I think it's obviously quite clear. But, it'd be good to touch on that more.
Yeah, so I just want to touch on the missile selection as well. I mean, obviously, we haven't been able to confirm whether the Hangors are coming with the YJ-18E, but
Yeah.
it's, I would say, probable. But I
Yeah.
think if you look at, when you describe the technical configuration, I found it to be interesting because in a couple of very odd ways, it touches on the two areas which the Pakistan Navy has been developing through original programs. So, for example, on the one hand, you have your subsonic cruising capability through the Harba program, which is basically like an anti-ship version of the Babur series. Then you have obviously like the recently tested Taimoor air-launched cruise missile, which is a conventional use case of the Ra'ad Fatah-II platform. So those are subsonic designs, basically. Then you have the Rasoob program, which I think sort of, emulates more on the Joint Strike Naval Strike Missile concept. All of these are subsonic, and then you have basically the rocket element, which is Project Smash, essentially, which is basically a navalized version of Fatah-II. So I think the YJ-18 sort of combining these two concepts into one platform might potentially give us a hint of where the Pakistan Navy and NESCOM might be looking towards as like a next phase. Could be to potentially start mating two of these abstractive platforms or two different distinct platforms into one integrated solution. So you could potentially have in the future a homegrown equivalent of a YJ-18E in the sense of where you have a missile that cruises for most of its duration, and then when it hits the terminal phase, or let's say a little bit before that, when it's within the reach of the target, after a certain point, it kicks into a ballistic phase, which would try to reach those supersonic plus speeds, basically. So I think it could be very interesting that if they do acquire the YJ-18E, if they could potentially get an understanding from China how it works, and let's say some developmental assistance, they could potentially build maybe like a sub variation or subfamily of what they have already. Of course, it's not to say this is news or anything. We're just sort of speculating, but it's just interesting that the two technology nodes in the YJ-18 align really well and map really well to the two areas of development which NESCOM is doing well in right now, relatively speaking. The third is the actual true supersonic cruising gap, and I think the difficulty with that has been that number one, it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to develop and produce these missiles because forget the the core technology, you need basically ramjet and scramjet technology in the long run. The issue is that the underlying infrastructure to develop them is just not available to Pakistan. Certain types of wind tunnel facilities, certain types of instrumentation equipment, they're probably excessively costly because of the sanctions regime on Pakistan and other factors. So with that, the Pakistan Navy's probably found that it's largely confined to basically importing these missiles off the shelf. And obviously, given how expensive they are, it's not going to have a very large number of them. I think it's sort of understood that. So it's moving towards more of a scalable approach where it's like, okay, if we cannot afford supersonic cruising platforms in numbers and cannot produce them locally due to restrictions, then what are the two platforms that we could potentially produce at scale, and how can we get more mileage out of them? And I think that's where you can go back to the subsonic question and the ballistic question. And those are incidentally, the two areas which the Pakistani munitions development scheme is basically booming right now. You have a growing number of subsonic cruising based solutions coming out, both from within the state-owned and private sector. And then you have, obviously, from NESCOM itself, the growing ballistic portfolio as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the only thing to caveat with that is obviously we've had the Chinese offer the HD-1 to the Pakistan armed forces and also offer it for local production, but that was never taken on board. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, the capabilities to produce these things at home is going to be quite limited because we just don't have the facilities to do them. Now, obviously, we could use somebody else's facilities, but then there's only so many available, and there's also obviously going to be restrictions on their use as well. So for the foreseeable future, I also agree with you that we're probably going to end up having to import these items, and potentially we can produce them locally to meet our needs, but there would be in very limited production numbers unless the other branches of the armed forces can pick them up as well, like we're seeing with Taimoor as well. Like, for example, we've got an air-to-surface, we've got anti-ship now. We've got AG. I mean, AG. The reason why I said AG and AES because they have different seeker options. But yeah, but I think this is something we'll touch on in a second segment in another segment of this episode.
Yep, absolutely. So just returning towards the submarine fleet and what have you, I think the next segment is pretty pertinent as well. Because as the Pakistan Navy has been inducting the Babur-class corvettes, it has also completed the induction of the Bilal-class frigates. I think there's been a bit of, let's say, some criticism on how they've been armed, to put it lightly. I think, everyone will agree that these surface warships and even the way the Jinnah-class frigate has been sort of configured up to this point, the munitions configuration speaks to, let's say, 2010s-esque, 2000s-esque configuration options where you have a small number of anti-ship, anti-surface munitions, around 6 to 8, plus 16 to 32 at best, vertical launch system cells for your surface-to-air missiles. And I think the criticism has been that, hey, like this configuration is not well suited for the sort of offensive deterrence and also the defensive role that the Pakistan Navy is expected to undertake. And basically, you know, especially relative to the way the Indian Navy is arming its forthcoming ships. I think one comparison posited that, you know, the Indian Navy's upcoming patrol ships apparently, or OPVs, would be better armed than Pakistan's, you know, Babur-class corvettes and Jinnah-class frigates. So I think, you know, we have maybe some stuff to unpack in regards to that criticism, but I think, at least from my end, it sort of goes back to the initial point, is that the Pakistan Navy traditionally has viewed itself as primarily a silent service, like primarily a submarine operating, and now in the future, in the words of the retired Chief of Naval Staff Admiral Abbasi, a submarine building navy. And I think that is a point we have to sort of, folks have to keep in mind, is that for the Pakistan Navy, even during the heyday boom of the surface fleet, has not viewed the surface fleet as a centrally critical fixture of wartime fighting. It is a very big fixture of deterrence in peacetime and in those sort of hazy times of tension. But when we hit a actual hot war scenario, all of the focus is going to go to the submarine fleet. And submarine fleet is going to be the primary vector through which they're going to start engaging in anti-ship and anti-surface, you know, anti-submarine operations. And I think that is the point we have to keep in mind, that for the Navy, due to the limited nature of Pakistan's fiscal capacity, due to the fact that on the east you have a very disproportionate, or rather you have basically a blue water navy as an adversary on the east, and on the west you don't really have real adversaries from a naval standpoint to speak of, that you have a unique sort of requirement set where you'll need the surface fleet to maintain a presence, especially in peacetime, especially in times of tension, like as we saw in the case of the Iran-US war and its fallout on Pakistan and the region. Like, you need the surface fleet to be there to have a presence, but going beyond that and expecting it to be the central war-fighting capability, especially in a close proximity fight with India, I think that's not been the way the PN has planned things, basically. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think it's one of the things that's consistently been the same across all CNSs, because sometimes we'll see one have one approach to things, but no, this is the one thing that's been consistent throughout the ages, is that the surface fleet isn't really going to be relied very heavily upon. I think the other angle that people tend to miss quite a lot is a lot of Pakistan Navy's service fleet ends up being sent on diplomatic missions, a lot of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, a lot of maritime patrols in other areas of responsibility, a lot of coalition work as well. And I think that's quite a big part of the Pakistan Navy's surface fleet, which obviously can't be done with the subsurface fleet. In terms of armament and whatnot, the one thing that people tend to miss is that it's not a case of, okay, let's just put more missiles on this thing, like, or, we can put dual ejector racks on a plane, and why can't we just do something similar with these? The first thing is the cam is, so firstly, there's only a handful of VLS systems in the world, right? So you've got the Chinese AJK-16, which is what the Type 054As are in use. Then you've got the Chinese UVLS. Obviously, you can't use your cam systems. You can't integrate your cam into these. The other ones are obviously the other main ones are obviously, you've got EXLS and slash Mark 41. Its derivatives. Then you've obviously got Silver from France, and then you've got the Turkish Mildas. The problem is Mark 41 EXLS type stuff wasn't available to us. Silver was not available to us. And let's say even Silver was available, the cost of something like that the Silver is a very expensive system because it's produced in such limited numbers. The Mark 41 has the scale on its side, which is why it's a relatively affordable option. It's probably even cheaper than the current solution the PN went for, but it's just not available to us. The third solution was Mildas, which I don't think it was available at the time. And these things aren't things that you can change on the fly. If the ship's already started to be built, you need to certify the ship, you need to certify the missile within to be operated from the VLS. That's obviously cost that the PN is going to have to front. But on top of that, you also need to, who says MBDA is going to approve of this? Who says Italy is going to approve of this? So firstly, we only had this option for VLS, right? This was the only option, and that it's one cell per missile. One missile per cell. It's a cold launch cell, and that's the other thing, right? Is I don't know whether Mildas is even you can even use soft launch missiles. I don't know, but that's a side note. But point is not everything was available to us. This was the only solution that was available. Now, in this, if we decide to put more missiles, we're going to need to start lengthening the hull quite a lot. And if we start lengthening the hull, then at some point you're going to need to change the design, or at some point you're going to need to make significant design changes, and that's cost and timelines that the PN can't afford. I think one of the biggest reasons why the PN went for the Ada-class from the Turks is that it's a proven platform. It's a proven platform that's everything's there, and it's also something that's buildable quite quickly. You know, these original programs, they take a long time. If you look at something like the Constellation class, that was a very long-term project, and that's with the US industry backing, the US industry backing it, and a lot of the stuff having been developed, and it was based on a proven design. But because there was significant modifications to it, that design process had been lengthened out, and we wouldn't. There's no reason we wouldn't have seen the same issue here. But on top of that, we'd also have to eat the costs, which is something we just can't afford to do. So when people say, "Okay, it's not armed enough," and whatnot, well, there's no other option. What else would you suggest, right? That's really what it comes down to. Other than that, in terms of anti-ship missiles, now this is the one place where I do disagree with the philosophy of the Pakistan Navy, and obviously this is just my personal opinion, and whatnot. So, the thing is I don't necessarily agree with the equipping of Smash to these boats. Firstly, if we just take the example of the Type 054A, we can see that we only see that it only carries 4 anti-ship missiles. Now, I was discussing this on PDF with somebody. TM302 weighs like 3 or 4 times the C802, and the Type 054A carries 8 carries 838 C208s. So at some point you can only carry so much weight on top of the deck before you end up punching a hole through it. And I have a feeling that we're going to end up running into the same issue with Smash on the Baburs and the Jinnahs eventually, is that you're going to need to really reinforce the deck, or you're going to need to carry less missiles. So potentially we might actually see a very light load of missiles on the Babur-class. Maybe something similar to the Type 054, where we only see 4 missiles be carried on top. That's a criticism I do agree with, and I don't really believe that shipborne anti-ship missiles, anti-ship ballistic missiles are a great idea. We've seen them be inducted and then removed from other navies like the Indians, the Chinese, and the Russians. But yeah, sorry, I think Bilal, you want to say something?
Yeah, so I agree with you. I found it really interesting that the Navy went with, shipboard ASBMs. Like, I don't have a problem with the Smash as a concept. I think, if you think about it from the Navy's coastal defense strategy, I think the Smash, along with the CM302, would have been a great mix for coastal defense posture. I think that's how the Chinese Navy, or the Chinese, have also been sort of employing their anti-ship ballistic missile stack as well in general. I do know they have some shipborne capabilities as well, but I think they really started with land-based, shore-based solutions. And as you said, these are heavy missiles, right? Especially like your CM302s and your, Smash/Fatah-II systems. I think the right approach would have been to sort of continue scaling the underlying deployment architecture that you already built with the Fatah-II for land-to-land, surface-to-surface, and then reposition that for surface-to-sea. So you have those mobile launchers which can shoot and scoot and what have you. And then you sort of network that with your satellites, your drones, your radars, and all that, and you have your coastal defense. I think when it comes to shipborne, I'm actually wondering if, like, even the PN, maybe the boat, no pun intended, maybe the boat sailed on the Babur-class corvette in the sense, but for the Jinnah-class frigate and maybe for like midlife updates, I think the approach that might get really interesting, because we do have a program in development which is comparable, and I kind of alluded to it earlier, would be something similar to the Naval Strike Missile. So, now if folks are going to criticize the Pakistan Navy for their configuration options, then I hope you take a look at the US Navy's successor to the Constellation class frigate program, which is the FFX frigate program.
Yeah.
And if you really had a problem with the Pakistan Navy's configuration, then boy, you'd really want to talk to a US Navy enthusiast. Think about the FFX right now, right? But
You should be.
that being exactly, but that being said, and you know what, and if just a joke here, but if the US wants to pass some production to Karachi shipyards or Gwadar, I think we can handle it. Just putting it out there. But anyways, one interesting thing about its configuration is that it could potentially carry up to 16 naval strike missiles. Right now, these are subsonic anti-ship missiles. They're not as big as your, CM302s or Smashes. Obviously, they're actually potentially smaller than the Harpoon-sized missiles or C802A sized missiles as well. But the interesting thing is that when you look at the core design, weight, specifications of the of the Naval Strike Missile and its air-launched derivative, the Joint Strike Missile, you know that actually Pakistan has a very similar program in development, which is called the Rasoob 250. And I think both the 250 itself is also an interesting moniker because it implies that there could be another number, maybe a 125, maybe a 500. So it could be a series of missiles being developed. And if you look at the design of the Rasoob 250, it really evokes a lot of the same kind of, design language as a Joint Strike Missile. So you have a stealthy air-launched cruise missile, small enough to be able to, be inserted within a stealth fighter, which I think was the intent behind the program. After all, it's Air Weapons Complex, which is probably designing it. So they're the ones who designed the ROD and the Taimoor cruise missiles. And I believe that, from my sense of or my reading, is that the Rasoob was designed in part to help with the Pakistan Navy in equipping the Sea Sultan when it comes online to provide that lightweight, anti-ship capability. So I think where it could get interesting is that if for the Jinnah-class frigate, if they pivot away from, the smash and what have you, and instead focus on maybe having, like, let's say 12 to 16 of, like, let's say a surface-to-surface launch Rasoob variant, I think that could get interesting in that sense. Obviously, it's not a supersonic striker, but at least it provides, in that peacetime deterrence slash conflicts, not conflict, but let's say like high tension scenario, it gives you that credible long range attack capability that you can have on the fly, basically.
Yeah, and obviously the other thing is we can see that now the Pakistan Navy is also interested in Daimoor as well. And I think in the interim that the Sea Sultan will probably carry Daimoors as well. But again, there's no reason why there can't be a ship launched Daimoor, which could be seen on the Jinnah-class. And obviously you could spend more money in developing that missile as well. I think also that the other aspect of Rasoob is because it's such a lightweight missile, we'll probably see it carried on the Pakistan Navy's drone fleet as well. And I think that's another area that we kind of don't look into, is that the Pakistan Navy clearly is interested in expanding their drone fleet via something like the Sharper. We see the Sharper 3 has an anti-submarine suite now as well. And we don't have the liberty of being able to develop stuff for the sake of it, right? If we develop something, it's probably because we need it and we want to use it ourselves. So that's something we could see the Rasoob be launched from, but also helicopters as well. The Pakistan Navy has always been carrying anti-ship missiles from on its helicopters. As our exocets start to die off, they start to expire, something's needed to replace those as well. But yeah, I wouldn't even say necessarily the ship has sailed on the Babur-class, because they're still certified for, stuff like the Harpoon and other anti-ship missiles, and they could easily be recertified. And those smash missiles as well, they're not going to waste, right? They can be launched from the surface. So potentially, hopefully, I sincerely hope that it's sort of an interim solution, because I realistically, at the moment, the Pakistan Navy has no other option, right? They can't, they don't have much available options that would work. That would be a drop-in option. So hopefully it's sort of just an interim type solution.
Yeah, and I just want to circle back on the supersonic cruising stack as well. Like, obviously, when it comes to like a CN-302 type missile, it's high cost. You're going to procure them in small numbers. But as you alluded to, there was a time period around 2018 or maybe 2022 where this random Chinese mining company basically designed, developed, and tested their own supersonic cruising missile, which is the HD-1A series, essentially. And this one can be launched from the surface or from the air. And I think, in relation to that, uh, change that could happen within NUSCOM could be that if the Chinese supplier pool was to suddenly have a glut of, supersonic, let's say, ramjet engines available for sale, that could potentially translate into, a potential Pakistani original designed supersonic cruising missile basically down the line. I don't think that is completely out of the realm of possibility, because whatever issues that China has, lack of production output is definitely not one of them. And I think, given the way that the US-Iran war has gone, I think countries like Iran, Pakistan, North Korea, and besides the suspect three, you could argue, let's say even the wider pool of other countries might really be interested in seeing if they can procure these like core critical inputs at like a reasonable cost to sort of build up their asymmetrical capabilities. So I think down the line, when it comes to inputs for rockets or subsonic cruisers, for supersonic cruisers, I think it's going to get really interesting if the Chinese like critical suppliers start, ramping up to meet a potential demand. Essentially, I wouldn't
Yeah.
I wouldn't discount it. Maybe there is still another supersonic cruising program. It's just that, for obvious reasons, Pakistan just cannot move it forward at this time due to the technology restrictions. But I don't think the restrictions are going to last forever.
Yeah, of course. And also the other thing is obviously the Turks also have their Ramjet programs. They've got Ramjet air-to-air missiles, but also they are working on developing a Ramjet anti-ship missile. Roketsan and TÜBİTAK signed a contract nearly about a year ago. So obviously there's also progress on that front, and the Pakistan Navy and also the Turkish vendors have a great relationship, and that's something that can also be expanded upon.
Yep. And obviously, we said that Pakistan has difficulty accessing certain instrumentation and testing equipment. But, as you saw with the, Russia-Ukraine war, Russia was able to get that equipment one way or the other. It shows that there's a massive, massive cost premium when you're trying to basically acquire these systems through, let's say, irregular methods. But again, if we go back into the history of Pakistan's nuclear program, what have you, being able to operate in the gray zone and operationally execute to acquire these things, it's not out of the realm of capability. It's just that there are a lot of competing priorities in terms of funding and skilled resources, where right now attention is going into certain areas. But again, once that stuff starts freeing up and maturing, you can start seeing more of a focus in other areas. And plus, it's also an issue of, I wouldn't call it hindsight, but let's say experience from other environments. I think, if the Pakistan military, and I'm sure they are, because if you look at their loitering munition and other procurement tracks, they've certainly taken it to heart. But if they observe, like let's say the Russia-Ukraine war and even the U.S.-Iran war, I think they will see there is a space for like these supersonic, potentially even hypersonic cruising solutions. Even if in limited numbers, they can play a role. So obviously, like, I think these are all ideas that are probably there on the roadmap. The problem is that, again, it's like an issue of funding priority and being able to what are you going to put at the front of the line versus what you'll have to put at the back. And I think right now, my sense is that they really want to scale up on the subsonic and ballistic side of the equation and the loitering munition side. So those are three things they've seen persistent throughout Ukraine and Russia, and also now in the US and Iran, that have worked out for the users across all of them. And I think also the inputs for these weapon systems are probably more readily available from within China, probably available at a lower cost, probably available right away. So right now is the time for them to build up their munition stockpiles along those lines before they go into the more advanced, high technology side of the equation.
Yeah, exactly. I think now the next segment we have is basically what we're talking about is the naval missile tests. So obviously we saw that the Pakistan Navy had test-fired the Taimoor on the 21st of April. And that was a air-launched cruise missile, a derivative of RAD, which was also a derivative, which then was derived into the Taimoor AG, and then now we've got the Taimoor AS, which is an anti-ship missile. With these, I think the key here is obviously reducing costs and increasing the scalability of these things, right? Is the RAD would have had a very expensive suite of navigation sensors like DS-MAC cameras and Tercom and all that sort of stuff. But with stuff like anti-ship missiles, you don't really need that. It could do very well on like an INS and GPS and its own secret and whatnot. So I think now we're starting to see that the armed forces are moving towards a scalable system. But also, I think the very interesting thing here is we're seeing that they are clearly making a distinction between their strategic programs and also their conventional programs. So, for example, we've seen Fatah being used both in a nuclear and also a conventional role via Abdali, but also now we've got Fatah-II as well. So we see that they're making a very clear distinction between the two programs. And once again, we see this with Ra'ad, and we also see this with Taimoor. We see this with Babur, and we see this with Fatah-IV now as well. So we can see that they're starting to make a clear distinction, and potentially this might even be a case of them trying to open themselves up to the international market to be able to buy components and systems for these missiles by pitching them as a purely conventional asset. What do you think?
I agree. I think one part of it is that they understood from the previous engagement with India that these conventional, both the ballistic side and the cruising side, are going to be very critical in terms of long range strikes. And we'll get to that in more detail with the Pakistan Army section. But they understood that, you cannot rest on just threatening to use these munitions. You have to have a healthy stockpile available from a conventional standpoint. Now, where it gets interesting for me, like I understand the investment in, let's say, the Fatah-II or the Fatah-IV, for example, right? Like you have your ballistic and your cruising options for long range strike. But where the tests of the Taimoor get interesting for me is that if you're going to scale up Taimoor production, and I hope they do, and I think this is a big indication that they are, because they're making them available for conventional purposes, obviously, then it implies that you have more platforms available to deploy them. So I think in an indirect way, and I know we've seen like web photos and we've seen like diagrams, official PDF diagrams and illustrations and spec sheets all saying that, the JF-17 can carry 2 air-launched cruise missiles, but we never actually got like a clear cut, hey, this is a JF-17 armed with two Taimoor missiles, here you go. We haven't gotten that yet, and I think that's going to come down the line. But I think as they start testing the Taimoor and inducting it as a conventional solution, I think we're going to start basically seeing these deployed from the JF. That means you have, I think this is going to go beyond just the Block 3. I think there shouldn't be anything stopping the Block 2 from operating it, because even the Block 1 could carry a 2 C-802A anti-ship cruise missiles. So basically, like, it shouldn't be a big jump to the Taimoor in that sense. So that means you have a large number of platforms capable of deploying munitions like the Taimoor, like the Azab series, right? The powered Azab, which is the glide bomb series, basically. So you have like the precision regular glide version, then you have the rocket, I believe a rocket assisted version, and then you have a turbojet powered version. So there's a lot of conventional munition options now emerging from an air launch segment. So I think that's another interesting sign that the Navy, the fact that, that they're more is being inducted evidently or tested across surface arms, that it opens up another interesting possibility as well. Now, on the other side of it, in terms of being able to access the international market, I think it goes both ways. I think one part is that the Pakistan industry wants to show that, hey, the Fatah series, the Harba, the Taimoor, the Rasoob, all the Azab, they're all available for sale. So for those who want to procure them, they're available. And I think if they can start leveraging, because they do design and product development really well, so they can produce the product. So like, they'll show you the Fatah-II, they'll show you the Rasoob, they'll test it, qualify it, it'll be ready to go. The issue is the mass production side, which is again like more of an industrial side of the equation, which is a weakness in Pakistan. So I think one option could be, and I think we discussed this in previous episodes and articles, is that look, Pakistan goes into the conversation with like potential industrial suppliers, like in Poland, Brazil, basically companies that know how to provide design CNCs and what have you to produce missiles at scale. And you basically do a trade. You go in, you tell them, look, we have a ready to go surface-to-surface missile platform. Can you help us and transfer the technology necessary for us to build the CNCs and other equipment so we can mass produce them in Pakistan as well? So we're going to give you a design that you can own, develop, and remarket anywhere you want. And in return, we get the production capacity domestically. And I think that is potentially their pathway. And I kept harping about like the sanctions regime, the restrictions and all that, but you also have to caveat that this was all led by the United States, right? And these regimes and restrictions were at their peak in the 2000 to 2020 period of time, where basically the world really respected and followed the international systems, the rule-based order and all that stuff. And I think it would be very hard to argue that that level of respect still exists today, given all that's happening, not just from the sense of the current war and what have you, but the fact that the US is inflicting tariffs everywhere. So it's forcing a lot of countries, who have been traditionally supplying critical, machinery and equipment to the American market. Suddenly they're going to be hit with tariffs and what have you. Suddenly they have to now evaluate, like, hey, if Pakistan's coming to me and saying, I have something ready to give you, right, from a product ready to, like, for example, I am a CNC producer, I'm an industrial manufacturer in Poland, so I know how to make missiles and stuff, but I don't have a design. Someone's coming to me, they're offering the design, and in return they're asking for me to help them build their industrial side. They're a mostly agrarian economy. That sounds like a greenfield market to me. So I think things are going to get interesting on that front. I think if Pakistan is feeling very comfortable with testing these munitions for conventional purposes, I think they're getting a read on the global market that could be tilting in their favor again. I think we might be returning to a world which is more similar to the 1960s, 70s when Pakistan pursued its nuclear program, where I think hopefully a lot of those US-led restrictions from the MTCR, Wassenaar Arrangement, all that kind of stuff is going to start to erode slowly. And the other factor is, you have the world's number one industrial power is China. If a lot of these countries, like your mid-tier industrial countries, like your Turkeys, your Spains, and what have you, they have to evaluate. Like, do you want to get subsumed by the top industrial giant? Do you want to have your profit margins eroded by tariffs? or do you want to start partnering with countries in the middle layer who can potentially open you up to, reciprocal trade, basically? So I think things are getting interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that sort of touches on most things. I think we can quickly touch on Smash, you can touch on Smash, which, as we said, is a derivative of Fatah-II. We see some modifications. Obviously, you probably have a modified warhead and Seeker type. And also, I believe we've got thrusters in the nose as well. This is the first test we've seen from the Babur-class corvette, so clearly it's some sort of certification test, because prior to this, the Pakistan Navy would use the F-22Ps for this sort of stuff. So we've already seen a launch on the F-22Ps, and we once again we're seeing this now from the Babur-class. So as I said, this is probably some sort of certification test. And actually, one interesting thing I want to touch on is it seems like we're starting to ditch the C802 from our inventory, so we're not seeing it as much anymore. So as I said, as you said, it was on board the JF-17s, but I can't remember the last time I've actually seen one being carried by a JF-17. Potentially it was pre-CM400 times. And now, obviously, we're seeing that the F-22Ps will probably ditch the C802 as well and equip themselves with Smash, leaving just, I think, 2 or 3 Azimuth-class FACs at the moment with them, because obviously they can't carry the Smash due to size. Heck, we don't even know if they'll stick with that. Maybe they could get something else. Maybe the rest of the fleet would be equipped with Herbaz as well. Who knows? But so there's probably a certification test for the class of ships. So I think there's not really a whole lot to say on that, other than probably we're going to see that they will be deployed on board the Babur class as well. I think now the next segment we can talk on, and I think this one is more for you, is the Army's precision fire and precision strike doctrine. So I'll let you have this and throw some questions at you after.
Yeah, for sure. If just building off the Fatah-II tests and the tests that preceded it, if we start going through the full portfolio of documentation, so that's from things like the stuff that NESCOM has been developing, like the Tipu guided shell, for example, to obviously the Fatah series missiles, for example, to even some of the the most recent Ministry of Defense production release, we're starting to see the ingredients for basically what I termed as precision fire and precision strike capabilities, basically. So let me put it this way. So precision fire is basically, your guided shells, guided tank shells, guided artillery shells, anti-tank guided missiles, right? Like your short range tactical use munitions meant to be used at very heavy scale against, enemy platforms. One other program that NESCOM revealed quietly was the Nishana precision guided kit, which is basically a INS/GNSS guidance refit for everything from older 105 to 155 millimeter artillery shells to mortar shells to even like your Mark 80 series general purpose bomb. So basically, if you want to quickly repurpose any munition on the fly into a guided munition, you'd basically integrate the Nishana PGK, which adds basically the new guidance secret plus a new fuse system that the armed forces had tested out maybe around 2 years ago. So basically, a lot of work was going on in the background to start essentially enabling the army to start deploying guided capabilities at scale. And it's not just at the munition layer, is that they're also invested in, for example, obviously we know from the recent satellite launch, the EO3 launch, that there's a massive investment happening or beginning to pay off, rather. This investment was obviously earmarked years ago, before even the recent conflict. But we're seeing that payoff happen now in terms of, the multispectral imaging intelligence setup. So you have basically your 3 electro-optical satellites. You have, I believe, one synthetic aperture radar satellite, not 100% confirmed. And then you have basically the hyperspectral satellite. And then they signed another deal for the future that will go into up to 20 other synthetic aperture satellites, basically building a constellation, essentially. So you have at a strategic level, you have basically this whole imaging intelligence setup being developed. And then you have this growing investment in drones, even within the army itself, right? The army is moving towards, altitude long endurance drones, obviously the Shepherd series. There's some rumors for some other platforms that might be coming down the line as well. Then you have like NESCOM developing like these shorter ranged vertical takeoff and landing based reconnaissance and targeting drones. And then you have like the investment happening from both the private sector and state-owned sectors for like, forward observers with like connected, basically optronics gear. So, when they see something, that data gets passed into a system, gets fed somewhere, and it gets distributed towards the digital fire control systems. And you have the automated mortar launching system that was revealed as well. I believe that's been either field tested or deployed recently. So again, that system is equipped with a digital fire control system. Obviously, your SH howitzer is equipped with a digital fire control system. Your Heather, VT4, and Al Khalid tanks are equipped with a digital fire control system. And then you got your Project 2P, P250, which can also handle a digital fire control system. So what we're basically seeing is that a lot of these pieces are beginning to like sort of not just be developed, but be deployed. And then, so now you have, for example, your actual munitions layer, which we just spoke about. Then you have the digital fire control layer. And then you have this other layer that's being developed, which is like basically NESCOM again through the POC fire program, which is like an artillery battlefield management system. Then you have the Rebar program, which is for the Armored Corps battlefield management system. So, and I'm sure Boston Army Aviation is probably going to have something of their own, maybe model after whatever the PAF is using, maybe like a sub variation of Link 17. And by the way, there was also, I think, Alan Warren's latest article, which is like about the Indo-Pak conflict, which released a few months ago, spoke about an updated version of the Link 17 called Skyguard. So all these pieces have sort of emerged, and what was interesting is that the army itself was building towards it, but they're missing this one centralized thing that could connect your ISTAR, which is basically your intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition, reconnaissance feeds, to your digital fire control systems, to your firing, platforms, basically. So that middle system, which basically been essentially like this data ingestion, sensor fusion engine type, data dissemination engine thing in the center that would collect all those ISTAR feeds and then make that into actionable targeting information for your forward units to use. And just so happens that the most recent MODP report actually alluded to this. So they called it I believe it was the Integrated Battlefield Management System, right? The IBFMS. So remember, Pakistan Army already has a battlefield management system, right? This implies something even bigger than that, right? Something higher level. And my theory is that I think the army is basically moving towards this approach where, okay, they've understood that they're building this huge portfolio of guided capabilities. So, we spoke about the precision fire, then we have the precision strike, which is more of your long range attack capability, which falls into your Fatah-IIs, Fatah-IVs, your cruise missile capable, like loitering munitions, like your, the couple, the ones that recently, I think it was like NESCOM revealed called Delta Baz or something. And even WooTech revealed something recent as well. Just like the High Mark 25 TJ. So, you have all these solutions coming online, being procured, being inducted, being whatever. And basically, your last layer is this one last component of the system that will help connect the targeting information that's coming from your satellites, your drones, your passive emitters, your active emitters like your radars, then again connect to the firing platform's fire control system to allow for that automated firing capability. And we know that exists because they actually revealed it within the recent self-propelled mortar system, which says literally that. So basically my theory was that the army is basically building these capabilities now. It's basically moving towards that dual precision fire and precision strike doctrine, because when you're inducting this many systems capable of this sort of capability, or like, let's say, equipped with these sorts of capabilities, that it's hard to say that this is going to be like an isolated, vertical. I think it's going to be more regular. And there's some signs where, for example, the Nishana, it's meant to basically retrofit your existing, can then be added to them at a relatively low cost. So I think the target was like $10,000 to $15,000 per munition, maybe even less. So basically, it would change the fuse and add the guidance mechanism and the the tail kit and what have you. So the whole point being is that my theory is that the army is moving towards it, and I think it's very interesting. And obviously, it's very easy to sort of be reductionist and say this was all because of the recent Indo-Pak conflict. But the thing is that the most recent MOD report, it was actually drafted like in 2024. So this predates that. Now, what might have happened since the recent conflict with India, that all this got accelerated. But I think otherwise, overall, I think this is going to be pretty interesting on the Army's end, because the implication here is that, very similar to the Air Force and the Navy, a big chunk of the Army, obviously not the majority, but I would say a conceivable chunk, is going to have to become very technologically centric. because they're managing all these complex data, all these complex systems basically, and they're basically managing. And I don't like using the terminology anymore because it's kind of been overused and it's very common in AI world, but basically like the kill chain, but basically the entire integrated network essentially between the sensor and the, oh my god, another cliche terminology here, sensor and the shooter. But basically, I think the army is essentially adopting this at a much wider level than people are giving it credit for. And I think it's going to be a pretty big shift by the time the next conflict rolls around. That's where, for me personally, that adds urgency to the conversation about whether the Army's decision-making apparatus is best served being so centralized, because you're now imbuing your frontline units with such capable firepower, and then they also have this, very robust ISTAR backend, and then you have at the center an actual automated system that can centralize all that information. So maybe you want to centralize the technology and the data transfers, but not necessarily the human decision-making component. That was basically my little, shtick. And we wrote about it in quite a bit of detail in like our different Cool Plus and Cool Pro articles, but primarily in the Cool Plus side.
Yeah. So on to the next segment, and this is more related, bringing it back to the Fatah-II. This was the first public firing by the Army's the newly inducted rocket force, which was, newly created rocket force, which was created specifically after the 2025 skirmish. This was the first training launch of the Fatah-II, which, just to recap, is a 400-kilometer plus range supersonic guided ballistic missile. And this is the first publicly acknowledged firing since the rocket force was formed in August 2025. The key here was, and I think you'll touch on this more, as it was framed more as a training launch and not as a developmental test like we've seen in the past. Potentially signaling that we're now in the operational deployment phase. As per the datasheet from GIDS, which I don't know whether we can put on the screen or not, but it's a supersonic maneuvering missile with a 365 kilo warhead and a 50-meter CEP or less. Now, I wouldn't worry too much about these numbers and get too fixated on the numbers, because that's obviously an export-oriented system that GIDS is now promoting. The local system that for the Pakistani forces will obviously vary, and so. Now, this touches back on what we were seeing before, is this multi-service arm adoption of certain systems, and the base being the same and each arm adapting the system to their specific needs. And so we see the Fatah-II and the Smash use a common core, which is obviously the Fatah-II. And once again, another example is the Fatah-IV and the Harba, and obviously the Taimoors. And then obviously now we see the Pakistan Navy adapt that common core to its specific requirements. For example, a 50-meter CEP is no good to the Pakistan Navy, right? That's a miss. That's the difference between a miss and a hit. So it's no good for the Pakistan Navy. But also we see that the Pakistan Navy, a Smash would have a different interception problem to deal with than a Fatah-II, for example, would. For example, you have CIWS and the short-range air defenses, because you're effectively dropping the missile onto those defenses. So now you need some sort of maneuvering capability to be able to defeat them, and that's where the thrusters come in, which we haven't seen on the Fatah-II convention, on the Army's one. So, Bilal, could you tell us more about the Fatah-II launch and its relation to the Smash tests?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, at the end of the day, this is more of like an industrial perspective. So with Pakistan, you have limited industrial means at the moment, both due to lack of technology access, which, as we kind of alluded to earlier, might be gradually less of an issue in the coming years. But on the other end, due to lack of funding and just a lack of present capacity, right? It's a country that has sort of ridden on the value generated by agriculture for the most part. And then it kind of skipped industry and then went straight into services, basically. So when you have a lack of mid-layer production capacity, you have to basically reuse as many things as possible, as opposed to setting up parallel production lines. And one way for Pakistan to develop that scalable conventional capability was to essentially start consolidating platforms. So I think what was interesting is that NESCOM, because remember, the development is driven by NESCOM here, whether it's for the Army, Navy, or Air Force. NESCOM decided at some point, and again, this predates the India-Pakistan war because these missiles were revealed before then, but at some point decided that it was going to standardize and build one core rocket platform, and then use that as a basis for different applications. So thus far, we've seen from the platform that has driven the Fatah-II, a conventional surface-to-surface missile, which is the Fatah-II, which was basically just underwent a training launch. Then the Abdali weapon system, which implies or suggests to be a strategic use weapon. So basically a, essentially to equip with miniaturized nuclear warheads, and basically something that builds upon the kind of capability that the Nasser series had already provided earlier, but now at much longer range. I believe it was like 400 to 450 kilometers. Then you have the Smash, right, which is your anti-ship ballistic missile. Now, obviously, between all three of these missiles, although they share the same core common platform, there are some marginal differences. I wouldn't say like marginal in the sense that they're insignificant, no, but relative to the fact that there's a common core which makes up like say 70% of it, there's a 30% of differences in the way of the guidance suite, the thrust suite, and all these elements to make it suitable for their specific applications. So, for example, you could potentially see down the line NESCOM trying and developing a indigenous analogous solution to the CM400 that the Air Force is using, right? Again, along using the same core motor as the either the Fatah-II or the Fatah-I. But the point being is that when you have the common core, you just have to produce that common core, right, at scale. So your goal is, when it comes to the common rocket technology, like that core rocket, your goal as NESCOM is to, cut out the Shaheen, all these older legacy production facilities, repool your resources into this one facility for this one core platform, and then produce as many of those as you can as quickly as you can. And again, the implication is that if the armed forces are moving towards conventional rocket use like this, then it implies that they're beginning to sort out the scale question, basically. Now, obviously, I'm not going to say that they've sorted out completely from 0 to 180 a year since the conflict, because we're heading 1 year into the actual conflict itself. But I think that's the direction they're now heading towards. So, in the next 2 to 3 years, it wouldn't surprise me if we start basically seeing them launch more and training launches and more smashes and training launches, basically. Now, that being said, the other implication from this is that, so we had another article on Hangor Plus, basically, which sort of mapped the development of the Pakistani Fatah series with the way the Iranians have developed their own ballistic missiles. And the interesting thing here is that, we noticed that since the time the Fatah-II was tested and the stuff that Pakistan's been doing, it maps pretty well to the way the Iranians had approached their ballistic missile program. So what I mean by that is that the Iranians, at some point, obviously much earlier than Pakistan, so maybe like, the Iranians did this in like the 2000s, Pakistan's doing this in like the 2020s, so there's like a big difference in time here. But what the Iranians did was they started off again with this core platform, and they started building on it. So what they did was, instead of focusing on, building these highly distinctive, different, missiles and rocket platforms for different ranges, they focused on one platform and started improving the technology around it. So that would be like the solid fuel composition mix, the aerodynamics, the casings, and the other elements. They started focusing on those areas to extend the range of their core platform. And my theory has been, maybe it might be bordering on hope, but I think Pakistan is at least, I think NESCOM is at least looking towards this direction. Whether they achieve it or not, we don't know. But I think their planning, or their hope, is that they would be able to achieve something similar over the next 5, 10, 15 years to begin producing longer range ballistic missiles based on the core platform that they're building right now. Again, by both indigenizing and producing these more critical technologies right around it. So the implication is that, given that the armed forces are investing so heavily in satellites, in passive emitters, in expanding their radar coverages, that they want to build a near real-time situational awareness capability, so they can pick up targets and understand them and build context around target movements and what have you, to be able to feed that information to long-range, attack options. And I think a big component of those long-range attack options are going to be like basically a new family of ballistic missiles down the line. Eventually, I'm not sure if they kind of gave the Fatah-IV name to the cruise missile, unfortunately. I think that was a naming miss. They should have called it a Harba land launch or something. Eventually, we might see like, Fatah-V, Fatah-VI, Fatah-VII.
Another Fatah-IV, because they've done this before where there was, we have two Fatah-IIs.
Yeah, we have two Fatah-IIs, yeah.
Yeah, so
So they might have to rename,
Fatah
give the
4.1.
Fatah-IV name back.
Yeah, so I wouldn't be surprised if we see another
Yeah,
Fatah-IV.
but I mean, again, like if you think about, and we'll go into this in the next section. The fact is, like, the image intelligence investment is so huge because once they've already built up a really good capability, but the problem with satellites is that you're going to replace them every 5 to 7 years. So meaning that this is an investment that has to stick. It has to have very high ROI, and the only way you're going to have high ROI from this kind of investment is to have the means to actually engage the targets you're picking up. So this is where I think them emulating Iran's approach to ballistic missiles is going to be the thing to do for moving forward. And again, just to be clear, the one thing we wrote in Pua is that Pakistan's 10, 15, maybe even 20 years behind what Iran has done. Like Iran was doing this in the 2000s, right? But the payoff, as we can see today, yes, maybe it was the loitering munitions that had the disproportionate effect in terms of on the ground damage. But at the end of the day, in Pakistan's case, for them, it's like they're going to use their satellite coverages and what have you to know what targets they need to hit. So they're going to be very selective of their targeting, but they need those, like, they'll need longer range variants of the Fatah to make full use of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So now this leads nicely on to the next section, which is obviously we had the launch of the EO3 satellite, which was developed by Suparco in Pakistan, wholly. This was launched by on board a Chinese Long March rocket. So we see the PRSC EO3 carries 3 experimental systems. So we see a multi-geometry imaging module. And what this does is it basically provides terrain imaging for 3D terrain monitoring, which is quite handy for our strategic cruise missiles, which rely on terrain contour matching and all that sort of stuff. We also see there's also advanced energy storage technology on board, and also onboard AI for data processing. The AI processor enables real-time analysis and anomaly detection on board, reducing reliance on ground-based systems. So this now means that Pakistan operates 5 dedicated remote sensing satellites. So we've got 5 types, which is 3 of the EO satellites. So we've got PRSC EO1, EO2 and EO3. And we've got 1 SAR satellite, which is the PRSC S1, and 1 hyperspectral, which is the HS1. This basically forms a coordinated sort of sensor triad. It's sort of, it's a sense of like the SAR detects a change, the EO provides visual detail, and then the HS1 classifies the material composition. The $406 million PSAT INSAR deal would scale the SAR layer to nearly hourly revisit rates, so allowing a far greater depth, level of information to be able to process. So, for example, our forces could get in real time monitoring of adversary assets and deployments, troop movements and air force movements and submarine, movements and whatnot. And obviously, this is something that you're going to touch on in far better detail because I'm way out of my zone here. So, firstly, what I want to ask is some more details on what the stuff I just mentioned, but also Pakistan's investment in satellites is pretty extensive now, and it's building towards something it has never had in the past, such as this multispectral imaging and the high refresh rates of the satellite images. You wrote a lot about it. You wrote a lot about how it needs to keep going into this space and keep improving and developing on what we've got now. Could you give us some more detail on that?
Yeah, so I mean, definitely, like, within the website itself, we talked a lot about the implications of each of these satellite systems and how they'll affect or improve Pakistan's targeting posture. And we can maybe dedicate another episode later to go into more depth into that. But I'd recommend our readers just go on the website and just check out those articles as well. Like, even if you're not a paid member, I think we have pretty deep excerpts available, so you can get the gist of what we're talking about anyways. But that being said, there are 2 issues here. Number 1 is because you're investing so much in the satellite capability right now, like, yes, for the next 5 to 7 years, you're going to have a very good imaging intelligence setup. But the issue is that with satellites, first and foremost, is that they have a very limited shelf life, right? So your imaging satellites, you might need to replace them every 5 to 7 years, basically. And that, at one level, that does work out in a positive way, in the sense that that allows you to iterate rapidly. So, your ability to do imaging, processing, and all that kind of stuff will constantly advance. So, for example, even within this example, he carries, according to Soparco, several new systems which they're basically testing out right now. So depending on how they go and what they're able to learn from it, they're going to deploy the improved variants of each of these new subsystems in future EO satellites, which have to come in the next 5 to 7 years because the old ones are going to deprecate. So with that, that's one aspect there. But the other side is that it is a massive investment to keep your satellite, your space-based imaging presence intact, right? It's a massive, massive investment. So this is where all those past reports about Pakistan wanting to build a satellite production center or the Pakistan Space Center and all that kind of stuff starts to make a lot of sense because, they're only relying on China for launches, for example, and you're relying on foreign suppliers for like very critical high technology inputs like the necessary optronics equipment for satellites. You have to master certain areas in the middle to be able to make this feasible indigenously, right? And that's where you get into the original design and integration stuff. And also in the software and the, let's say less tangible elements, but they're still very important. So that's one aspect, is that if Pakistan wants to maintain this, it's going to have to make space development a very big portion of its, procurement outlay. Because my fear would be is that if, God forbid, you have another fiscal crunch, and I mean with Pakistan, that's like not even like that hypothetical, right? It's very probable. Then you might regress in your imaging capability in the future, right? Satellites have to be constantly replaced in order for you to maintain the targeting capability. So I think that's been one of the, I don't want to say fears, but let's say one of the concerns of Pakistan's national security planners in the past was probably, look, satellites cost money for us to, we can maintain, we can, for a 5 to 7 year period, we can build a imaging setup, but how are we going to maintain it? Maybe now, especially thanks to, again, the massive production output in China, the cost of getting those critical inputs and putting them together is not that much anymore. So maybe now satellites don't cost as much as they used to back in the day. So maybe that has become one factor. Or maybe the other is that the armed forces in general have realized that they need to take control, they need sovereign control over targeting information. And as you said, and you alluded to, like things like the 3D terrain modeling, things like the upcoming, interferometric synthetic aperture radar, Constellation, these things will help the armed forces provide very high fidelity, up-to-date mapping and terrain data to feed into their cruise missile systems, for example, right? To ensure that they're avoiding the threats, they're making use of the terrain for like skimming and terrain hugging, and are reaching their targets in the most optimal way. And the ability to constantly refresh that information and update those missiles and their guidance stacks constantly is going to be a very big advantage. However, for you to use that advantage, now this goes into the second portion of the conversation, is that it's one thing to have satellites and to be able to replace those satellites. That's one aspect. But the other aspect is this intermediary software line of the equation. And again, in Pakistan, we're not known for having a strong software development engineering industry. And I think it's a huge opportunity, but we need mechanisms that allow developers from within Pakistan, those who want to work with Pakistan, to be able to leverage all this rich imaging data and to use it in a way that's going to be productive. So for example, the Army precision fire and precision strike conversation, right? You have this integrated battlefield management system being developed. Wouldn't it be good if that battlefield management system was complex and robust enough to be able to ingest that imaging information and directly process it, parse it, and then disseminate that information into not just the firing units, but potentially into like the cruise missiles directly before they're equipped to the fighter plane and they take off. Like there's so many things you have to develop in the middle to enable that kind of seamless, sensory capture to information utilization circle, basically. And that is I would say, like the big industry opportunity, especially for Pakistan's private sector, to start studying. See, I'm being vague about this because it's still very conceptual. There's a lot of new things that we're just not used to talking about because, frankly, in the Pakistan defense discourse, we've sort of been like stuck in the my F-16 is better than your Su-30 type of situation, or my F-17 is better than your Tejas situation, and not into the more fine and detailed and, let's say, maybe not inherently complicated, but very much like skills-driven conversations about, hey, what kind of software stacks are you using? What kind of technology are you developing that allows you to make use of this rich imaging data and not put it to waste, or not let it kind of just go to waste, basically. So there's this huge other industry that needs to grow, and it's the state-owned sectors are not going to do it alone. This is an area where you're not going to do it alone, because the problem is that the talent you need is going to be all abroad, right? Like, even if you want to confine yourselves to Pakistanis and what have you, I'll guarantee you the Pakistani origin software engineers studying in America, Canada, UK, what have you, are learning way more about this stuff than those in Pakistan right now. Or rather, there are more of them than there are more of them in Pakistan right now. And even those in Pakistan are going to come to the West for advanced studies in this area as well. I know a guy who basically, did his PhD in AI, or like AI-related research in Toronto before going back to Pakistan, basically. But he works in the private sector and he's a teacher. So this is the issue. Why is this guy a teacher and not working within the actual like industry stuff, right? Within this stuff. And that's the problem. So that's my fear, is that we won't take advantage of the opportunity that all this infrastructure is going to provide starting right now. Like, you have 5 dedicated remote sensing satellites. What are we making how is that stuff getting translated into outcomes right now, right? And in relation to that, again, there's a lot of great, intermediary development work opportunities here. So, I mean, definitely in the case of E3, you have an example of Suparco itself taking the initiative. So they introduced basically like a onboard AI-powered data processing unit. So they're basically trying to take as much of the strain off of ground-based systems, but eventually the data is going to need to reach the ground in some capacity anyways. Once it reaches the ground, do we have a stack that will sort of, ingest it, parse it, and disseminate it? And I think that is going to be the next big phase. And, for what it's worth, being a partner to China is a very good thing in this sense, because I believe that they've probably excelled the most in developing those sorts of technologies, basically. And the satellites are basically, many of them are coming through the Chinese market anyways. So I think this is the opportunity for Pakistan. Like, if there's a starting point, it's like, I would say, like, for example, if you consider NASTAP, I mean, I don't think NASTAP should be going into drones and things that cause redundancy with, NESCOM. Rather, NASTAP should define itself more as like this software development powerhouse, like, Pakistan's one Palantir, for example, and start sending, or let's start this way, start recruiting, in cybersecurity and those sorts of engineers, and sending them to China for additional training, so they come back and you can start developing, at least, let's say, as a starting point, the foundation layer systems to manage the satellite infrastructure.
And yeah, I think that sort of covers this episode quite well. There's some things obviously we didn't get a chance to talk about, but if we did, this episode would probably drag on to 2, maybe 3 hours. So I think this is a good place to call it, and I will hand it back over to you now.
Yeah, thanks, Arslan. So again, thank you once again to our listeners for tuning in, and hopefully we'll be returning to our weekly episodic schedule. It just so happened that the 3 of us just walked into some really weird scheduling issues on our ends. Probably an exceptional circumstance, generally doesn't happen, but moving forward, we'll be back week to week. So take care, everyone. Goodbye, and see you next week.
See you. Bye.